Okay then, brethren, last week we spent our time in Daniel chapter 9, which you may remember is referred to very often as Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy. You know, Daniel had been looking at the prophecies of the prophet Jeremiah, and he could see in Jeremiah that God had said he would send Jerusalem and Judea into captivity to Babylon for about 70 years. And Daniel could see that, hold on a second, that 70 years is pretty much up round about now. And at the end of that 70 years, it looks like, if we wish, our people in captivity here in a foreign country could go back to Jerusalem. And so Daniel went to God in prayer and asked God to act, to open up the opportunities for the people of Jerusalem to go back, to restore Jerusalem, the city of God, and of course to rebuild the destroyed temple of God. That's what was in Daniel's mind. And God sent an angel with a response. Angel Gabriel came with a message to Daniel that is, well, okay, Daniel, you're very concerned about the 70 years being up for the desolations of Jerusalem and the temple, but actually, you need to know, Daniel, there's another 70 ahead of you, 70 weeks, the 70 weeks prophecy. Of course, weeks being the Hebrew word Shabuah, or Shabuim, which means 7. So Daniel, forget that 70 years. You've got another 70 sevens, another 70 weeks, another 70 Shabuim ahead of you before finally, at long last, the city of Jerusalem and the temple is restored to its full glory, to everlasting righteousness. That's 70 sevens away in the far distant future. And we know it wasn't a continuous 70 sevens. Hopefully you remember some of this, at least from last week. You've got 7 sevens, 62 sevens, which would bring you up to Messiah. And then there's a final 7. So 7, 62, and one final 7-year period. And that's the one that you and I are probably most interested in, because that's still ahead of us. That's prophecy yet to be fulfilled. That final 70 years. 7 years, I should say. And in that final 7-year period, the final one, we have the prince who is to come. And according to the scriptures, at the midpoint of that 7 years, the midpoint of the 7 years, so it's clearly 3.5 years in, he will stop the Jewish sacrifices from taking place on the altar, and he will install or trigger the abomination of desolation, the abomination that desolates, halfway through that final 7-year period, right? Now, if you're a Church of God person or have a Church of God history, you'll have a somewhat different view of that in all likelihood, because the most popular opinion among the churches of God is that the prince who is to come, who will confirm a covenant for 7 years, that final 7 years, is none other than Jesus himself, right? Jesus is the prince. He will confirm a covenant for 7 years. Question mark there, of course, straight away. And halfway through that, at the midpoint, Jesus will die, thus bringing an end to sacrifices, because Jesus is the final sacrifice. You don't need animals after that. So Jesus brings to an end the sacrifices halfway through that final 7 years, and that's it. And if you go back into worldwide Church of God literature and similar, that's sort of the story you'll probably find. But of course, there's some difficulties, we said, with that last week. First of all, Jesus confirms this new covenant for just 7 years. What's that got to do with anything? And in the midpoint, apparently, Jesus is crucified, so thus Jesus' first part of his ministry was 3.5 years, with 3.5 years yet to come. Well, there's two problems at least there. One is, who says Jesus' physical ministry when he was on the earth in Galilee and Jerusalem was 3.5 years in duration. I know we hear that a lot, but can you find it in the scripture? If you can, you're doing pretty well. But if you look up, if you Google this or look up, Wikipedia somewhere, you'll find that there's a number of opinions as to how long Jesus' physical ministry was. A little over a year. Some people hold to that. I think personally that's a bit too short, but some people go with a year. 2-year period is quite popular. Quite a number of scholars, historians say, Jesus' ministry was about 2 years in duration. Quite popular to find 3 years or 3 years and a few months. Some people say 3.5 years. So there's actually no real consensus as to how long Jesus' ministry, physical ministry was. Who says 3.5 years? It might have been. It might not have been. Nobody actually knows. So first of all, if Jesus' 7-year ministry is how he confirms the new covenant, and he's killed at the halfway point, at the midpoint, well, we don't actually know. His personal ministry was 3.5 years, and if it was, where does the other 3.5 years go? Says the prince who's to come will confirm the covenant for one final week of 7 years. So if Jesus did that for 3.5 years, where's the other 3.5 years? Place of safety, a millennium, the apostles to the Jews, up until the martyrdom of Stephen. You got a few guesses there, but they are just guesses. And one final thing I'd say before we move on is the angel said to Daniel 7, 62, and 1. One final 7-year period. He didn't say half and a half. It's not 762, a half back in 30 AD, and another half 2,000 years or something later. It's not 762, a half. It's one complete 7-year period with an important thing happening in the middle. That's it, as far as I can make out, right? And of course, Jesus did give this as a warning. When you see the abomination of desolation, that's the key sign to us all. To sort of sweep that under the rug and say it's Jesus' ministry in 2-3.5 year periods, once back here and once somewhere else. I checked an article this week written by a person in I think it's currently the biggest church that got out there, and we're talking about Daniel 9 and verse 27, and the prince who is to come, and it says, Jesus Christ, and his first 3.5 year ministry on the earth, and he died on a Wednesday. That's halfway through the week, so you can see the links there. And then he says, and the final 3.5 years are going to be somehow, somewhere, sometime. Well, that's clear, isn't it? And it gives you no idea, because it actually makes no sense. Okay, that's last week. So let's move on. We're going to start with chapter 10. And today we'll do probably chapters 10 and 11. At least that's the hope. So let's read in chapter 10, verses 1 through 14, and get the sort of the gist of it. And we're going to look more closely at it. So Daniel 10, verse 1. In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a message was revealed to Daniel, whose name was called Belteshazzar. The message was true, but the appointed time was long. And he understood the message and had understanding of the vision, unlike some which he really struggled with. This particular vision, which he's about to describe coming up shortly, Daniel got most of it. He sort of thought, yeah, I think I can see that. Verse 2. In those days, this is prior to the vision, this is what prompted the vision. In those days, I, Daniel, was mourning 3 full weeks. The same word, Shabuah, but clearly not years. Not this time, this is days of weeks or weeks of days. I ate no pleasant food, no meat or wine came into my mouth, nor did I anoint myself at all, till 3 whole weeks of days were fulfilled. So 21 days. That will be significant, as we'll see later. So Daniel was sort of abstaining from certain luxury goods, sort of like keeping Lent, almost. My mum used to keep Lent. In fact, if she was alive today, she'd still be keeping it, because Lent goes all the way up towards Easter. And in Lent, she typically gave up sugar in her tea, and typically gave up cigarettes. She was a chain smoker. Yeah, I think she did 140, 150 cigarettes one night when she was feeling a bit stressed out. Well, she could hardly speak the next day. Her voice was completely gone. She also used to give up chocolate. So this is what obviously Daniel was doing. He must have been a pre-Catholic perhaps. So he's giving up certain comfort items. And verse 4, on the 24th day of the first month, as I was by the side of the great river that is the Tigris, I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, a certain man clothed in linen, whose waist was girded with gold of Uphaz. His body was like a beryl, his face like the appearance of lightning, his eyes like torches of fire, his arms and feet like burnished bronze in colour, and the sound of his words like the voice of a multitude. Clearly not an ordinary man. This is quite striking, this individual. And I think if any of us had seen this individual, we'd, be feeling a little bit sort of like, what's he come for? And I, Daniel, verse 7, alone saw the vision, for the men who were with me did not see the vision. But a great terror fell upon them, so that they fled to hide themselves. They obviously could sense something was around, and they took off. Daniel could actually see this man who looked like gold with flickering flames of fire for his eyes and so on. Verse 8, therefore I was left alone when I saw this great vision, and no strength remained in me. For my vigour was turned to frailty in me, and I retained no strength. Went all peculiar, as they say. Yet I heard the sound of his words, and while I heard the sound of his words, I was in a deep sleep on my face, with my face to the ground. So I guess he sort of slumped over in a faint, sort of trance of sorts. Suddenly, a hand touched me, which made me tremble on my knees and on the palms of my hands. And he said to me, O Daniel, man greatly beloved, which is, we saw that last week in the previous chapter, you are greatly beloved, said the angel Gabriel to Daniel first time round. Here he says, O Daniel, man greatly beloved. And it says the same a bit later. So, yeah, Daniel was clearly outstanding. If you get a message sent to you by God, by a powerful angel, and he says, you're greatly loved. You know that, Daniel? You know, the Father, the Ancient of Days, the Son of Man, Jesus the Christ. They see Daniel as an absolutely outstanding individual, greatly beloved. Understand the words that I speak to you, and stand upright, for I have now been sent to you. While he was speaking this word to me, I stood trembling. Then he said to me, do not fear, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard. How long had Daniel been abstaining and fasting? 21 days, right? 3 full weeks. Daniel gave up all these luxuries. He gave up his cigarettes, his chocolate, sugar in his cups of coffee. And for 21 days, he'd been, frugal as he humbled himself and sought understanding from God. And here the angel says, from the first day, your prayer was heard. But that would have been 21 days at least earlier, surely. And I have come because of your words. But, verse 13, but the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. And behold, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I had been left alone there with the kings of Persia. So this is interesting. God sends this angel, which appears to be Gabriel. I don't think he's explicitly named here, but I'm pretty sure it's Gabriel. It's the one that God sent to Zacharias with the message about John Baptist being born. Angel Gabriel sent to Mary, the young virgin girl, about the birth of the Lord Jesus, her son. I reckon it's the same angel here, and it's certainly Gabriel the chapter before. But Gabriel says, as soon as you prayed 21 days ago, I was sent to bring this response to you, this vision, to answer your prayer for understanding. But, verse 13, the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me those 21 days. I couldn't get through. And it says prince of the kingdom of Persia. It's obviously not a human prince, eating his bananas and his, wheaty bangs for breakfast, who's going to hold back the angel Gabriel, or the angel, whoever he was. This is a spirit being. The word prince in the Greek version of the Old Testament is archon, A-R-C-H-O-N, archon, a powerful being, a ruler. So what you've got here is this prince, this archon, who's over the kingdom of Persia, today what we call Iran, has actually withheld me. He's pushed me back. I'm an angel, possibly Gabriel, with a message from the Ancient of Days to Daniel, and I can't get it through. I've been held back for 21 days in the spirit realm by this archon, this prince, this spiritual ruler who is over the kingdom of Persia. But behold, he says, Michael, one of the chief archons, one of the chief princes, in fact, of course, he's the Archangel Michaels, we find out, later in the New Testament. This is the Archangel, the first of the angels, the primary angels, the Archangel. He came to help me because I'd been left alone there with the kings, plural, of Persia. So there appears to be more than one spirit being, one, I guess, primary spirit being, archon, principality over Persia. And I couldn't get past him. I was held back for 21 days with this message from God to Daniel. But thankfully, Michael comes along, provides some extra spiritual oomph, and now I've come through. And verse 14, now I have come to make you understand what will happen to your people, clearly the Jews around Jerusalem, in the latter days, for the vision refers to many days yet to come. So that's quite interesting, the response that God apparently responded immediately to Daniel's prayer, but the answer didn't come for 21 days, because in the spirit realm of our heads there was conflict, there was opposition, there was resistance, right? And we don't know a great deal, of course, about that, but you can see it's there. It had to take the arrival of the Archangel Michael to help to get Gabriel, if that's who it was, through to Daniel. And you have to wonder sometimes when you and I are praying to God and asking and seeking and so on, other times when God sends the response, sends the answer, right? It's on the way, like the angel Gabriel here, but perhaps it's going to be delayed, held up, held back by spiritual forces. And you and I think, I guess not happening this time. I guess God's not interested in responding to me this time. And we give up, go on about our business, because we've not realized that potentially the answer I'm looking for is on the way, but there's a spiritual battle above my head, and I need to hold fast and remain faithful, because I don't know what's happening up there in the invisible realm. If we hold your place there, but turn to Ephesians Chapter 6, you can see the Apostle Paul actually warns us of this. So Ephesians Chapter 6. Reading verses 10 through 13. Ephesians 6, beginning in verse 10. Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armour of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. Our margin says the schemings or the stratagems of the devil. Put on all the armour that God makes available so that you can stand against the wiles, the tactics, the strategies, the schemes of the devil. And I think that implies that the devil has different schemes for different people. What the devil can take you down with might be different to what he takes me down with, and vice versa. All right, the devil knows your weaknesses and mine for sure, right? And it looks like the devil has schemes, plans, plots, wiles, and he sort of orchestrates and arranges to take you down using the particular tools, methods that will do that. He may appeal to a certain weakness. He may press you in a certain area, right? And for me, he might do differently, and so on. But that's why we all need the armor of God. Verse 12, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, against other human beings, as we probably think we do, but this is who we're really fighting against. This is where our conflict really is. But against principalities, that's the same word, back in Daniel chapter 10. In the Greek, it's archon, right? So it talks about the prince of Persia, right? That's this principality over Persia, what we call Iran. Against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts or forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Therefore, since you're fighting against at least 4 different types of spirit being here, principalities, powers, rulers of the darkness, wicked spirits in the heavenlies, that's 4, either 4 ranks in some sort of hierarchy or just 4 types of being, not clear, but that's enough, right? So we're not just fighting against like a demon. There's at least 4, maybe there's more than that. Paul only refers to 4 here, right? Verse 13, therefore, take up the whole armor of God, all of it, not just a few bits, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand. When the battle's over, you're still standing because you've got the whole armor on. But you can see there that Paul's making it very plain that our battle is not against flesh and blood. That might be what we see, but the battle is in the spirit realm. So you can go back to Daniel chapter 10. And you got to think, looking at Daniel chapter 10 there, and the fact that the angel was held back for 21 days by the prince of Persia. Well, archons, principalities, I don't think they die. I don't think they get old. I think they're sort of, immortal spirit beings. So we'd have to assume, I think. I don't think it's really speculation. My friend Nebuchadnezzar alerts to speculative comments made by yours truly. But surely today, that being is still there. The principality over the area of Persia, one has to imagine, is still there today. That principality over the region of Iran. And not just Iran or Persia, I would imagine that most parts of the world have a principality over them, right? So where do we get to? Daniel 10, let's go back to verse 14. Pick up there, and we're going to read from verse 14 all the way through to chapter 11 and verse 1. Verse 14 again. Now I've come to make you understand, Daniel, what will happen to your people in the latter days. The your people being, I think he means the Jews in particular, in the latter days. For the vision, which is about to be revealed, refers to many days yet to come. Certainly implies a long way off. And it will be a long way off, as we'll see shortly. Verse 15, when he had spoken such words to me, I turned my face toward the ground and became speechless. And suddenly, one having the likeness of the sons of men touched my lips. Then I opened my mouth and spoke, saying to him who stood before me, my Lord, because of the vision my sorrows have overwhelmed me, and I have retained no strength. For how can this servant of my Lord talk with you, my Lord? As for me, no strength remains in me now, nor is any breath left in me. And I'm sure if you and I met an angel and we knew it was an angel, I mean, sometimes angels appear to be just other human beings. You can meet the occasional church member who reckons they've met an angel, but, disguised as an ordinary human. But this didn't look that way. This was like, gold and lightning and thunderous voices and so on. So you and I would struggle, I'm sure, as well. Then again, verse 18, the one having the likeness of a man touched me and strengthened me. And he said, O man greatly beloved. We all knew this. Daniel. Wow, God likes this guy. Fear not. Peace be to you. Be strong. Yes, be strong. So when he spoke to me, I was strengthened or encouraged. and said, "Let my Lord speak, for you have strengthened or encouraged me. I feel better now." And he said, "Do you know why I've come to you? And now I must return to fight with the prince, the Archon of Persia. And when I have gone forth, indeed the prince, the Archon of Greece, will come." So, yeah, there's Javan, of course, is the actual Hebrew there, the area of Asia Minor, today predominantly Turkey, but other countries around it, right? So there's at least another principality. There might be more than one, of course. Might well be more than one. But certainly there is at least a principality over Iran. There's a principality over Turkey. Imagine there's a principality over Greece, over Saudi Arabia, over lots of countries. Verse 21, "But I will tell you what is noted in the scripture of truth." And then in brackets, we have, "No one upholds me against these principalities, these archons, except Michael, your prince." Michael appears to be particularly sort of, if you like, assigned to Daniel's people. It looks like the Archangel Michael is assigned to the Jews, to Jerusalem, perhaps to Israel, right? It says there, "No one upholds me against these others, these spirit powers, except Michael, your prince. Also, in the first year of Darius the Mede," a little bit earlier, I stood up to confirm and strengthen him." So it looks like Michael was struggling a bit in those days against these spirit forces. And it looks like Gabriel says, "Well, back then, I stood up and helped Michael. And of course, recently he's come to my aid, so I can come through to you and give you this vision that God sent you, which had been held back for 21 days. So that's quite sort of interesting in some ways. Now, when we get to Daniel 11 and 12, well, actually Daniel 10 as well, it's all one continuous vision. Remember, there were no chapter breaks when the Bible was written. Chapters only came along, I think, maybe 1,000 years ago, probably less, thinking about it. So when this was written, given chapters 10 and 11 and 12 is actually all one. That's why it's a bit dodgy sometimes, which you'll hear somebody says to you, blah, 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 blah. Let's turn to Daniel 12 and read verses 1 and 2. Well, not entirely wrong, but Daniel 12 verses 1 and 2 is not the start of the thought. It's not the start of the message. The message starts in chapter 10 with the introduction and the arrival of the angel, and the actual words of the message start in chapter 11 and run all the way through 11, all the way through 12. So be careful not to divide these things in an artificial manner. It's one long, consistent vision. Now, if you look there at verse 14, just before we leave, you'll see there it says, the angel says, "Now I've come to make you understand, Daniel, what will happen to your people in the latter days." Right? For the vision refers to many days yet to come. Now, of course, some folk will say, "Oh, well, yeah, but that's many days after Daniel's time. It's 100 years later, or 200 years later. Nothing to do with the end of the age. Nothing to do with 2021 or 2030 or anything. That's just the latter days from the perspective of Daniel. Maybe 100 years later, 200 years later. But I think Scripture will show us that the latter days and the many days yet to come, it's future from our point of view, right? Just look at chapter 12. Let's read verses 1 and 2. Chapter 12. 1 and 2, remember, this is not a separate vision. This is the same continuous vision that we've just started, right? And at that time, Michael shall stand up, the great prince or archon who stands watch over the sons of your people. So we know that now. The Archangel Michael is assigned apparently to the Jews, right? That's again what it said earlier. It says the same thing here because it's the same consistent vision. At that time, what time? Michael shall stand up, the great prince, the great archon who stands watch over the sons of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble such as never was, since there was a nation even to that time. So that's the Great Tribulation. Jesus said in Matthew 24, a time of trouble unequal to any other. Well, you can't have two times of trouble unequaled to any other unless it's the same time. So this is talking of the tribulation just before Jesus' final return to the earth, right? At that time, your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. Verse 2, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. So the same continuous prophecy that starts in chapter 10 and runs to the end of chapter 12 tells us that at this time, it's the time of the great tribulation and it's the time of the resurrection, right? So that's not way back in the days of Daniel and 100 or 200 years later. This is telling us that this scripture, which the angel says is for the latter days, for many days yet to come, is actually bringing us right up to the time of the resurrection and right up to the time of the great tribulation, right? So, okay, let's go back then, and I'm going to start in verse 2. Now, when we sort of start in looking at chapter 11, it starts in ancient history, as we'll see when we begin shortly. So you start with ancient history shortly after the days of Daniel, and then it runs all the way up to the Great Tribulation, the resurrection, and somewhere or other it moves from talking of historical events and moves into yet future events. It sort of the history fades away. There's a transition, and we move into the future. There's, of course, as you'd expect, some dispute over quite, when that transition takes place. Most conservative Bible scholars will tell you around about verses 32 or maybe 35 or maybe sort of 40. So when we start reading the early verses of chapter 11, we'll see events there that are clearly very historic. And then as we go through the verses, we're not going to read them all, by the way, we'll get to the point where there's a transition and it moves into the yet future. And the verse where that transition takes place is a little bit up in the air. People have a different sort of views. But we're going to read the early verses. We're going to discover there's a theme in chapter 11. And that theme is the age-old rivalry between two great powers in the Middle Eastern area, right? And this rivalry started way back shortly after Daniel's death. And the rivalry runs all the way through the centuries. And the rivalry is going to run right up to the return of Jesus Christ, right? It's an age-old rivalry. The two powers are the king of the north and the king of the south. Those are the two key players right up to and including the end time. And it's relevant to us because look at verse 40, before we start properly in chapter 11. Verse 40, at the time of the end, and that does mean the time of the end time. That's typically talking of the last 3.5 years before Jesus finally arrives back at the Mount of Olives. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind with chariots, horsemen, and many ships, and so on. So at the very end of the days, just prior to Jesus Christ's arrival, the king of the south and the king of the north are still fighting each other. This rivalry has run for over 2,000 years and still got some way to go, right? So we'll find as we begin now in Daniel 11 that king of the north, king of the south, these are the two key players. That's really what the rest of the book of Daniel is on about. So I don't want to read all of it, like I said earlier, but let's start with verses 2 to 4. So Daniel 11, the angels brought this revelation. Verse 2, and now, says the angel, I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings will arise in Persia. That's the empire they're currently in. Cyrus and Darius and so on. Daniel, behold, 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than them all. By his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. Then, verse 3, a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. Almost certainly Alexander the Great. one of the greatest military leaders of all history, of the great Greek Empire, which stretched from Greece all the way through the Middle East, right away across to Afghanistan and to India. I mean, an unbelievably huge empire. And when he's arisen, verse 4, his kingdom shall be broken up and divided toward the four winds of heaven, but not among his posterity, nor according to his dominion with which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be uprooted, even for others besides these. You know, Alexander the Great was a great military leader, no question about that. He died in his early 30s, and his empire was massive. I mean, like, huge empire. And when it broke up, it wasn't a question of, they all just threw dice to see who would get it. There was a lot of fighting and battling went on between this general and that general, this leader, and so on and so forth, all across the entire empire. They refer to this period as the Wars of the Diadochi. Diadochi is D-I-A-D-O-C-H-I, D-I-A-D-O-C-H-I, the Diadochi. That just means successor. So these were the successors of Alexander the Great of Greece. And for a period of nearly 50 years, these generals fought each other. They occasionally married into each other's families, right? But eventually, there's about 20 plus at one point. That was a huge empire. There was plenty of territory to go around, right? Plenty of wealth to be divided up. But eventually, they sort of shrunk from the sort of 20 plus to 5 and then 4. And it finally ended up with two primary individuals, two primary dynasties that ruled the entire former Greek Empire. The king of the north and the king of the south is what the Bible calls them. So let's just read a few verses here just to get the gist of that. Not going to read all the verses because it's, I don't think, strictly necessary. But let's read verses 5 and 6. Also, the king of the south shall become strong, as well as one of his princes, and he shall gain power over him and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. And at the end of some years they shall join forces, for the daughter of the king of the south shall go to the king of the north to make an agreement, and so on. So here you've got these key players. This is way back in the days following Alexander's death, as the huge empire began to split up, and you have now what the Bible refers to as the king of the north and the king of the south. And of course, they're interacting with each other. There's marriages going on to try and, bind them together without necessarily fighting. It doesn't always work very well. Look at verses 9 through 15. Also, the king of the north shall come to the kingdom of the king of the south, but shall return to his own land. However, his sons shall stir up strife and assemble a multitude of great forces, great armies, and one shall certainly come and overwhelm and pass through. Then he shall return to his fortress and stir up strife. So there's no peace in these days. And the king of the south shall be moved with rage and go out and fight with him, with the king of the north, who shall muster a great multitude. You get the gist, right? These two players are really extremely jealous and envious of each other, and they fight with huge armies, moving up and down through the Middle East as they fight and war with each other. But the multitude shall be given into the hand of his enemy. Verse 12, when he has taken away the multitude, his heart will be lifted up, and he will cast down tens of thousands. But he will not prevail, for the king of the north will return and muster a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come at the end of some years with a great army and much equipment. Verse 14, now in those times many shall rise up against the king of the south. Also violent men of your people shall exalt themselves in fulfillment of the vision, but they shall fall. So the king of the north shall come and build a siege mound and take a fortified city, and the forces of the south, the king of the south, shall not withstand him. Even his choice troops shall have no strength to resist. And on it goes. But that's enough, I think, right? You've got the gist of it. In chapter 11, we have the king of the north and the king of the south fighting each other century after century after century, including right up to the time of the end. at Jesus' return. So it's been an age-old rivalry and conflict. Now, of course, the Bible calls it King of the North, King of the South. That's not what history refers to it as. And we can find out who these nations are. We've got, I think, a map we can put up here. I'll leave it up for a little while. I'm going to talk around it for a little bit. But there's a sort of a map of the general areas. You've got greenish at the top and the bluish at the bottom, the north and the south. Up in the north, one of the major generals of Alexander, when he died, was General Seleucus, Seleucus, General Seleucus, Seleucus Nicator, Seleucus the victor. And he eventually conquered all of that you can see there, right, from Turkey, right, all the way across the Middle East through Syria, Iraq, Iran, the southern Russian states, all the way across to Afghanistan, Pakistan, even as far as India. Huge empire, tens of millions of people. And that's Seleucus. He started a dynasty, and it's called the Seleucid Dynasty, right? And all of those countries belong to the King of the North. But then down the south, the general who became supremely powerful down south was Ptolemy, Ptolemy, General Ptolemy, and he began strangely enough, the Ptolemaic dynasty. And that was powerful over the areas of Egypt and Libya, Sudan, Ethiopia, right? And if you're standing in Jerusalem, Israel, then to the north is the Seleucid dynasty, the Seleucid Empire, the King of the North, and to the south is the King of the South, which is the Ptolemaic dynasty, Egypt and Sudan and Ethiopia and Libya. What you might see if you look at the map there is, what you won't see is Western Europe. So, most people say the King of the North is Germany, in cahoots with, Belgium, France, Spain, Hungary. No. The King of the North, the Seleucid dynasty, was never in those areas. It's all Asia Minor and heading east. Or if you're, say, Mr. Gerald Fleury, who says the King of the South is Iran, what? Iran is not south of Jerusalem. Iran is sort of east and north of it, right? Iran comes under the King of the North, right? So that's the areas we're looking at with the King of the North and the King of the South. And as we get through chapter 11, at some point you leave the history and you transition into the future. Now, like I said earlier, many commentators will say, verse 32, 35, maybe 40. Well, I think personally it's 21. So we're going to start there. So Daniel 11. We're going to start reading in verse 21 because I reckon this is now future. There's reasons why I can say that. We'll get to it next week perhaps.
Oh, right. And
in his place, verse 21, talking the previous King of the North, shall arise a vile person. So this is the final, I'm saying this is future, right? This has now got to the final King of the North, the one who will fight against the final King of the South at the time of Jesus' return, right? And the final King of the North we also know as the Antichrist, the little horn, the man of sin, right? This is him. Verse 21, and in his place shall arise a vile person, contemptible, all right, to whom they will not give the honor of royalty, but he shall come in peaceably, I guess like a wolf in sheep's clothing perhaps, and seize the kingdom by intrigue. So whoever this guy is, when he turns up, he's going to look okay to start with, although he's going to be a vile person, contemptible, evil. With the force of a flood they shall be swept away from before him and be broken, and also the prince of the covenant. And after the league is made with him, the translations say alliance, some sort of covenant, you could say. And after the league is made with him, he shall act deceitfully. So he's vile, contemptible, deals in intrigue, and is a deceiver. So get the gist of what this guy's like, right? For he shall come up and become strong with a small number of people. He shall enter peaceably, even into the richest places of the province, and he shall do what his fathers have not done, nor his forefathers. He shall disperse among them the plunder, spoil, and riches. buying friends, and he shall devise his plans against the strongholds, but only for a time. Verse 25, he shall stir up his power and his courage against, oh, what a surprise, the king of the south, with a great army. Well, it doesn't like Egypt and its allies. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army. But he shall not stand, for they shall devise plans against him. So here, the final king of the north, the little horn, the pompous, arrogant horn, the Antichrist, is in battle with the king of the south. And you can, by the way, you can see there that, clearly, well, I'll just read verses 25, 26, 27. Yes, those who eat of the portion of his delicacies shall destroy him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. Both these kings' hearts shall be bent on evil, not a good one between them. And they shall speak lies at the same table, but it shall not prosper, for the end will still be at the appointed time. So the king of the north, king of the south, liars, deceivers. They're fighting each other, right? But what that does tell you, at least in passing, is that at this time, the Antichrist doesn't have everything his own way. Some people think the Antichrist dominates the entire world and nothing can move against him. Well, clearly not the case. Because the king of the south, Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, Libya, perhaps some others in that area, they're pushing against the king of the north. They're pushing against the Antichrist. They're not yielding to his desires, even though these are all Islamic countries, right? Verses 28 to 31, while returning to his land with great riches, his heart shall be moved against the holy covenant. Talking, I guess, of the land of Israel. So he shall do damage and return to his own land. At the appointed time he shall return and go toward the south, talking of the king of the north, but it shall not be like the former or the latter, for ships from Cyprus shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return in rage against the holy covenant and do damage. Just before we move on, it says ships from Cyprus. The Hebrew word there is kittim, K-I-T-T-I-M in English letters, kittim, and translators often show that as from the western coastlands. So not the little island of Cyprus exactly, but talking of the western coastlands of the Mediterranean. So that probably implies ships from Germany, France, Spain, other countries there, coming against the king of the north. So there's some opposition to the Antichrist. It's not just he just waltzes over everything in his way, right? So here he has this pressure against him from Western Europe, and he sort of changes his plans somewhat. But moving on in verse 30, so he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant, and forces shall be mustered by him, armies, arms, weaponry, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress, that's the temple. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation. Now, you're familiar with that, right? The king of the north, which we otherwise call the man of sin, the Antichrist, the little horn, the pompous horn, all that stuff. At this point, he enters the Jerusalem. He defiles the sanctuary fortress, that is the temple. He stops the sacrifices, and he places the abomination of desolation. This, of course, in chapter 9, takes place at the midpoint of the final 7 years. So it tells us where we are. That's the chronology, midpoint of the 7 years. Just beginning the final 3.5-year rundown until Jesus' feet are on the Mount of Olives. Great tribulation, just about to start, right? If we accept that this is the one and only abomination of desolation and don't faff around with Jesus' ministry of 7 years, 3.5 there and 3.5 somewhere else. Now, at this point of this king of the north creating this abomination of desolation and so on, most commentators, like 90+%, will tell you, oh, this is ancient history. This is talking about this guy called Antiochus Epiphanes, who did this in 168 BC, right? That's what the commentaries will tell you. And there was a man called Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus God Manifest, as he called himself, right? He was one of the Seleucid Dynasty, a king of the north. He did enter Jerusalem in 168 BC. He did kill tens of thousands of Jews. He did forbid circumcision. He was a cruel guy. He did enter the temple. He did slaughter animals. It suggested he slaughtered some pigs and poured their blood around an altar to Zeus, right? So he certainly was a guy who was like, right, an abomination of desolation. He was an evil man. He may well have been, if you like, a sort of shadow of the final king of the north, the final abomination of desolation, right? But this is actually talking about the final one, right? Verses 32 through 35, and that's a sign that Jesus told us to watch for, right? Verse 31 there. When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, there it is, standing in the holy place, there it is, then let those in Judea flee. That's it. There's only one abomination of desolation. I don't think there was one in 168 BC. He might have been a bit of a forerunner, but this is talking about the abomination of desolation. Verses 32 to 35. Those, and the Great Tribulation, of course, starts now, remember? So Jesus said, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, verse 31, if you're in Judea, you need to get out in a hurry if you're paying attention, which, of course, not everybody will be paying attention. And at this point, the tribulation begins, and we can read that in verses 32, 35. Those who do wickedly against the covenant, he, the king of the north, shall corrupt with flattery. But the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. Oh. Saints are going to be busy. And those of the people who understand, the saints, shall instruct many. I guess if you're around at that time, you'll be saying, that's not the Messiah. That's a false prophet. Do not take that mark. That's the mark of the beast. The Bible tells you not to take that. So the saints at this time, as the Great Tribulation gets underway, will be, I think, facing their finest hour to warn, to instruct, to do great exploits in this very difficult time as a little beacon of light in a very dark place. Yet for many days they, the saints, shall fall by sword, and flame by captivity, more by plundering of your houses. Now when they fall, they shall be aided with a little help, but many shall join them by intrigue. Beware of false brethren. Verse 35, and some of those of understanding shall fall, to refine them, purify them, and make them white until the time of the end, because it is still for the appointed time. So, these are the saints performing great exploits in very dangerous times. It does remind me a little bit of the fifth seal of Revelation 6, the tribulation right there, the martyrdom of those who stand up for the word of God and for their testimony and love not their lives to the death. All right, so there'll be martyrs at this time. My suspicion is that God will pour out his Holy Spirit quite powerfully in these days to empower people like you and me who are pretty wishy-washy most of the time. I mean, I wouldn't like to go out against the beast power and the man of sin and tell people all about it. Prefer to go and hide somewhere safe. But if God pours his Spirit out, like it mentions in Acts chapter 2 and Joel chapter 2, in the latter days, God will pour his Spirit out on your sons and daughters, all men and all women. And they'll go out and preach and proclaim powerfully. I think that's what we're seeing here. Let's carry on with verses 36 through 39. Then the king of the north, he's still the subject. Then the king of the north shall do according to his own will. He shall exalt and magnify himself above every god, shall speak blasphemies against the God of gods. I mean, this is almost quoted by the Apostle Paul in 2 Thessalonians 2, talking about the man of sin, who sits in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God, right? It's almost the same thing. shall speak blasphemies against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the wrath has been accomplished. For what has been determined shall be done. He shall regard neither the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any God, for he shall exalt himself above them all. This is the arrogant little horn, the pompous little horn. Who needs gods when you've got me? Verse 38, but in their place he shall honour a God of fortresses, weaponry, arms, and a God which his fathers did not know he shall honour with gold and silver, with precious stones and pleasant things. Thus he shall act against the strongest fortresses with a foreign god, which he shall acknowledge and advance its glory. He shall cause them to rule over many and divide the land for gain. And then verses 40 through 45. At the time of the end, we're past the abomination now, right? We're into the time of the end, the 3.5 years before Jesus descends on the Mount of Olives, right? That's what we're talking about. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him again and again and again, right? This is the second time in this chapter. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen, with many ships. He shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through, right? So this age-old rivalry, it's not going anywhere, right? Even in the last 2 or 3 years of the age of man, they're still at it with each other. Verse 41, he, the king of the north, shall also enter the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape from his hand, Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon, which appears to be the area of Jordan, and it could include parts of Saudi Arabia, which is in that area as well. And people have said, oh, do you think because Petra's in this area, that's sort of a hint that, saints, Petra, right? I doubt it personally. But of course, people in Judea, Jesus said, if you're in Judea, you need to flee to the mountains, and that would be there. So yeah, those parts might be somewhat protected, at least for the people fleeing from Judea. If you're living in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Manila in the Philippines, around Toronto, Vancouver, San Antonio, I don't think it applies to you. Verse 42, he shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. That's, of course, the main part of the king of the south. It doesn't win. I think this time, king of the south bit off more than he can chew. He shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver, over all the precious things of Egypt. Also the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall follow at his heels. Ethiopians is probably actually Sudan. The Hebrew is Cush, or the Cushites, and that's almost certainly actually today's Sudan. But news from the east and from the north shall trouble him, the king of the north. Therefore he shall go out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many. And he shall plant the tents of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end, and no one will help him. So what you got here at the very end time is the king of the south can't leave well alone. Not after 2,000 years of fighting. So the king of the south provokes the king of the north, who swarms down against him and pummels him and defeats him. And that's actually a major battle that takes place at the very end time. Now, we think we've got time to look at Isaiah 19. Isaiah 19, so hold your place there. Isaiah 19 is a prophecy of what happens to Egypt in the end times. It's probably one of the most important prophecies in the Bible about Egypt and what's going to happen to it from now to the very end, but we're just going to read the first 4 verses here. And this is dealing with what we've just been reading there in Daniel 11. The burden against Egypt, the weighty prophecy against Egypt. Behold, the Lord rides on a swift cloud, and he will come into Egypt. This is, Jesus Christ, often referred to as the cloud rider, because there's so many scriptures in the Old Testament talking about Jesus riding in the clouds, coming in the clouds, moving swiftly in the clouds. We even got a song, he on a cherub swiftly rode, and on the wings of wind his flight, right? But Jesus is the cloud rider. and it generally refers to his coming in battle. So, behold, the Lord rides on a swift cloud. He will come into Egypt. The idols of Egypt will totter at his presence, and the heart of Egypt will melt in its midst. That's talking of Jesus arriving in Egypt. It does seem that Jesus goes to Egypt first on his physical return, on his white horse and so on, and then moves from Egypt up through the wilderness area, past Mount Paran and into Israel, and to his feet descend on the Mount of Olives. But he's going to Egypt first. And then you've got the next 3 verses talk about some of the troubles between now and then. I will set Egyptians against Egyptians. Everyone will fight against his brother, everyone against his neighbor, city against city, kingdom against kingdom. That's already happened to an extent. You might remember the so-called Arab Spring, Arab disaster of 10 years ago, 11 years ago, 10 years ago. Egypt went through all that. There was civil war in Egypt. Mubarak was forced to resign. The Muslim Brotherhood came into power for a year or something. Then they were booted out. The current president is a former military man. It's quite an authoritarian country today, totalitarian. It's a huge country, over 100 million population. It's one of the top 10 military countries on the earth, Egypt. Mustn't ignore it. It's a huge, powerful country, very proud country. But it's had a lot of civil unrest in the last 10 years, and there's a lot more coming. You can see there, Egyptians against Egyptians, everyone against his neighbor. Verse 3, the spirit of Egypt will fail in its midst. I will destroy their counsel, and they will consult the idols and the charmers, the mediums and the sorcerers. And notice, verse 4, the Egyptians I will give into the hand of a cruel master, and a fierce king will rule over them, says the Lord of hosts. The cruel master, the fierce king, is the king of the north, the Antichrist. We even got that language in Daniel 8, which we're not turning to, but in Daniel 8, which we did do if you were around 3 or 4 weeks ago, it talks about the king with a fierce countenance. Same guy, the little horn, who grows strong and powerful and arrogant. So verse 4 there, it talks about the cruel master and the fierce king. Egypt comes under the rule of the king of the north, the fierce king, for a little while before Jesus arrives to deliver the people, which later verses sort of talk about. So back in Daniel 11:44, we did read there, I'm not going to turn back now because we're pretty much out of time, we did read there that tidings or news from the east and the north worry, trouble the king of the north, and he goes off to annihilate, right? Now, there's nothing identified there, but if you look at a map, who would be to the north, right, of this area? Russia, to the far north. Who would be east of all these areas? China. So it does sort of imply that news or tidings or warnings of Russia on the move, China on the move, cause the king of the north to go off to annihilate. And he moves his headquarters, it says, between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. Think, what seas? Well, if the threat is from the north and the east, and some seas that you could choose to get your headquarters between would be the Black Sea, maybe the Caspian Sea, maybe the Red Sea, maybe the Persian Gulf, right? Because it does look like Russia and China want a slice of the action. So there are rumors that they're going to head this way, and that's going to scare the pants of the Antichrist. He's got another major battle to get it ready for. And of course, think of Russia and China. Middle East is where the Persian Gulf is. It's where all the oil is. There's a lot of wealth and money there for the taking, so you can see what might be attracting them. So anyway, the way we look at it, you can see that Daniel's 70th week, that final 7 years, there's an awful lot going to be happening, right? With the abomination of desolation and the king of the north and the king of the south. So there's a lot of stuff that you and I can get ready for and look forward to, right? Especially if you're going to be an end-time saint, perhaps playing a very important role in the time of the end. We'll obviously see about that, won't we? Okay, that will conclude today's Bible study.